I've actually spoken, of course, at different events and so on, and sometimes I get Chinese people, CCP type people coming up to me and saying, "Oh, how dare you criticize the Chinese Communist Party?" And one of the narratives they'll say is, didn't America invade Iraq as an excuse of why the CCP invaded, for example, Tibet?
Right.
And, oh, didn't America have colonialism? Didn't the West? Why can't the Chinese Communist Party have it? They try to create this equivalency,
right,
of course, in their narratives. What would you say to that?
Well, look, the United States and rest of the rest of the free world isn't innocent, isn't perfect. China's not perfect, right? And we clearly realize that. But the difference between not just the United States itself, but the difference between the free world and the Chinese Communist Party run China is that in the free world, at least we can hold ourselves accountable. For example, the Japanese internment, that was wrong. Slavery, that was wrong. But I can say that it is wrong because systematically I was taught about what had happened. And my teachers, I remember my fourth grade teacher, giving us a book assignment on the Japanese internment camps and said, these were human beings, American citizens, many of them patriotic American citizens that were taken away in these internment camps. And we have to make sure that something like this never repeats again. You have that kind of accountability system, and thank God we do, right? And the Iraq War, look, a lot of people have given their analysis to it, right? And now a lot of us realize that there was a lot more troubling factors about it than we realized in the past, right? But why do we have that system? Why do we have an opportunity to say that something was wrong and something was not wrong? It's because we have a system where we can at least correct ourselves, and that is how democracy runs, because human beings are inherently imperfect. Now let's look at a system run by the Chinese Communist Party. Do you also notice how every single one of their arguments have a reason behind it? Well, we invaded Tibet, they'll say, because it was a feudal system that was run by some Lama dictatorship, and we freed them. They'll have the same arguments for Southern Mongolia and what they began to call Xinjiang or East Turkestan. They said these people were backwards, these people were uneducated, but we went in there and saved the day. That sounds a lot like the KKK, for example, saying, well, gosh darn, we brought these minorities, we gave them education, we gave them all these great benefits in this country, and that's why, everyone's enjoying what they're enjoying today. When in reality, it doesn't matter what race or background you're from. As Americans, we have the ability to build a better world here by holding ourselves accountable always. But for the Chinese Communist Party, I have not seen a single factor where that was applied in their system. And so that would be the narrative that I would provide. And that is probably the best narrative that these CCP sympathizers can hear. But also at the same time, I'm sure a lot of the programs that you've done in the past were done in the United States. Strangely enough, however imperfect this system is, they sure love to come over here, right, and enjoy a lot of the benefits that we have, right? I mean, if someone hits them, I'm sure they'll take it up to our court system, right, to rectify it, as they should. So, and it's a lot more sinister, too, because one of the things that the CCP does is that it has an inherent need to convince the world that at the end of the day, they are supreme. They are above everyone else. And unfortunately, you see a lot of Han supremacism in that as well. And that's the reason why, and strangely enough, this is actually imposed upon the people of Hong Kong as well, and towards the people of Taiwan as well, right? It's like, well, we are the dominant people, and so we will do our best to, correct all mistakes, all sorts of problems in your land, right? When, if you look at it, a lot of Han Chinese people aren't sympathetic to what their government are saying, right? So that's another sinister part behind the CCP, because they would, just because of what makes up their background, right? They'll use that, they'll weaponize it in order to justify their crimes. when the rest of the country knows that it's bad, but they can't say anything. So I would say those are the biggest systematic differences. And thank God, I'm living in a free world where I can look at something and say that is wrong. And I can teach my children to make sure that they don't make the same mistakes as I do.
Now, I know one of the narratives I've heard tossed around, and including, in fact, by even some Western journalists and academics, is they say, oh, well, China uplifted the Chinese people out of poverty.
Right.
Now, I've personally responded to that, and I said, no, they suppressed the Chinese people. China was, of course, coming out of coming out of a feudalist society, as was most of the world in the early 1900s and late 1800s. The CCP tries to take credit for the bringing about of technology. Like, no, that was a product of Western capitalism.
Right.
That was brought into China.
Right. Exactly. Right.
But of course, but they try to say the Chinese Communist Party says there'd be no new China without the CCP. That's one of their slogans, and I've been shocked to see how many Western academics and journalists pick that up and actually believe it.
Sure.
I'm curious, though, based on, because I know you've spoken to those people as well, how do you often explain that? How do you talk about that?
Well, firstly, in terms of prosperity, we need to define what prosperity means. Does prosperity just mean money? And in that case, yeah, China would technically fall under that, successful nation. But that's really not the reality, is it? Right? The wealth of China, I'm sure the CCP had a role in it, but in a genuine sense, it was the Chinese people that made it into a reality, right? When you have an open market system, human beings, no matter what you are, will take advantage of that, right? To make yourself grow, individual growth, as some may call it, right? That concept was transported into China, and the Chinese people said, you know what, I'm going to take part in that. And a large portion of the Chinese economy grew because of the Chinese people doing that, not because some government official in the CCP, giving them all the directives on what to do. One thing that Deng Xiaoping did well is not doing anything. He didn't do anything. He just let the economy grow, right? But now, let's look at it from the present context, right? The CCP knew that this growth was going to happen, and then they said, one of the CCP does well is figuring out how they can actually have a say or have a complete control over it. And even though they call themselves proud, quote unquote, communists, a lot of these party members, especially those on the top, have huge shares and presence in these markets. So going back to these academics, right? Unfortunately, we had academic freedom, independence in this country up until, I would say, maybe even 10 years ago. But when universities started to rely heavily on the Chinese students' tuitions, and I would even say there's also a factor of cancel culture where professors want to just pretty much criticize the U.S. as much as possible, but also at the same time interpret that as, well, in order to do that successfully, I need to praise a system that's other than the United States. I personally have seen that on some of the professors that I've had in the past. They would praise the Chinese Communist Party, they would even say, well, despite the human rights conditions, they've done so well, and they have a system that doesn't have a capitalist founding. So we support them, in a sense, right? But they said, well, when it comes to human rights, well, we can talk about that later. It's terrible, but that's every country has a bad human rights record. So they'll be extremely dismissive of it, right? So my answer to those individuals who call themselves academics would say, well, Chinese government has done a great job in terms of bringing their people out of the poverty. Well, that's a lot more degrading to the Chinese people than ever, because what you're essentially saying is the Chinese people, at least to me, it sounds like Chinese people are somehow unable to take advantage of a free market like we do, right? It's at the end of the day, it was all the government effort that made it all possible. And we know that it's not true. And I would even go as far as to say this, is that, this narrative about, the Chinese people being another Chinaman, I would even say, it's extremely degrading. In a way, it's alive today in the Western world. Many people would not realize it, but they're in that pool. And stuff like that, by saying that, like, well, the Chinese people are different. The CCP has done at least a good job in bringing them out of the poverties that they were living in. I mean, well, are you basically saying that the Chinese people are not good enough for democracy? They are. Many of them come to the United States and have become amazing democratic figures, and have become amazing members of society that I and many of us come to respect. So I would even say this is the time to keep ourselves and hold ourselves to a higher degree, and accept the fact that the Chinese people, are equal to all of us, and they deserve equal treatment as every single one of us on this planet. So, and I would even say, unless we do away with such narrative, we will never ever be able to address the threat that we're facing from the CCP completely.
I guess just last question. In terms of your coalition, based on what could happen, and based on why you do the work you're doing, if you were to tell people one thing about the importance of this kind of drawing the line with the CCP,
sure,
and what is at risk in terms of that as well if it fails, what would you tell them?
Well, failure to me is not an option. But if it does happen, I think all of us would agree that the least that we want to do is to tell each other that at least we gave it our best. But the sad part about your question is that could only happen if the world does not wake up to the threats of the CCP. And at the end of the day, it's up to the individuals in this country to firstly come to awareness of that threat and act in accordance to what they think is the most appropriate thing to do, and in the best of their abilities. And I think at this point, I can clearly tell you that since its founding, the Captive Nations Coalition has been made up of individuals that pretty much have said to themselves, I'm not going to quit until my family is free from the concentration camps. I'm not going to quit until my culture is protected. I'm not going to quit until someone that's the Dalai Lama could return to Tibet, and seat himself as the leader of the Tibetan people. So as long as that determination is alive, I don't think defeat will ever really happen. And even just mentioning the Chinese people themselves, this flaming fire for freedom and democracy that many of dissidents and just even the rest of the Chinese people who genuinely want it, defeat will not come as long as that fire is alive. And that has been demonstrated throughout the years since the founding of the CCP. I mean, look at what the Falun Gong practitioners are doing, for example, right? Let's set aside everything for a second. Despite the limited resources, despite the attacks that they're getting constantly as an evil cult or some other vilifying terms, they've done an amazing job in terms of protecting who they are, but also going beyond that and saying that China can be better, and that we need to let the world know that the CCP is an evil monster. The Chinese Christians, they're paying their price, with arrests, torture, a lot of times executions, organ harvesting, Despite all that, the Chinese people and the members of these captive nations have put up a fight. So I don't think any of them are looking into defeat, but the more that this fire is raging on, the closer to victory we are. And that's our primary focus, so that one day the restoration of their independence and freedom can be achieved. And as long as that is also alive, the term defeat will never apply to any of them. I can assure you of that.
Se-Hoon Kim, thanks for being on the show, and thanks for doing what you're doing.
Thank you.